the screen share up here. Okay, 1 second, folks.
Yeah, if it's possible just to speak a little bit louder too.
Sure.
Thank you.
1 second while I set this. As the title implies, we're going to take a look at the cybersecurity requirements for financial services, in particular New York State. And technically, we're past the 6-month mark, so really I should have titled this the 7-month status check, as the 6 months was back in at the end of August. So we're even more behind the 8 ball if we're not compliant at this point. So a little bit of background about the regulation. In late 2016, New York State Department of Financial Services announced what a lot of people categorize as a first-in-nation regulation, not recommendations, but a regulation that's going to be measured to protect New York State from ever-growing cyber threats. The impact of this legislation, the covered entities, they need to establish and maintain a really robust cybersecurity program to protect the financial services of New York State and the financial services consumers of those companies. High-level requirements of the legislation, and we're going to do a kind of a deeper dive a little bit later and find out where we are with respect to compliance milestones. But high level, you really need to build out a proper cybersecurity program, which includes written policies and procedures, risk assessments, monitoring, testing, audit trails, access control, basically the litany of everything that is really encompassed in a robust cybersecurity program. In particular to this legislation, the impacted parties, or what they term as covered entities, is really anybody who's licensed or authorized as a financial services company operating within New York State. So that includes obviously banks, credit unions, money lenders, check cashers, insurance companies, and the like. So there are lots of companies that deal with financial services that are likely impacted by this legislation. There are some limited exemptions to this particular legislation, but from what I understand, it's few and far between, and people who submit for exemption, a lot have been turned down. So there are some important dates that go along with this particular legislation. In the past, we had March 1 where the proposed rule becomes effective. We just had a technical compliance date go by back in August. So that was really the first technical challenge to meeting this compliance drivers for this particular regulation. In February 15, 2008, there's an annual certification of compliance, which means that companies need to certify that they have done essentially everything that was due on August 28th, which we're going to talk about. March 1 is the second compliance milestone, of which there are some technical controls that need to be implemented. August 31st, 2018 is really the third wave of technical controls that need to be implemented for compliance. And then in March 2019, that's not a misprint, is the final technical controls that need to be implemented, of which there are only one, but we'll discuss that. Of the 16 high-level compliance requirements, these are the dates when you must have these implemented and be in a state of compliance. So you'll notice I highlighted what was just past due in August 28, and there are 7 of those. We're going to drill into each one of those, but basically those are the ones that if you are not compliant, if you don't have these 7 controls in place, you're likely in a state of incompliance at the moment. And then we have the dates of the forthcoming compliance drivers. So on August 28th, the first set of technical compliance controls that need to be implemented are the following. You need to have a cybersecurity program in place, and this is really the cornerstone of any any good security program is that if you don't have your roadmap established, your governance, risk, and compliance drivers on paper, you know, it's kind of like navigating the ocean without a chart. So you don't really know where your program is going unless you've actually taken some time to document, you know, how you want it to lay out. So that's one of the biggest challenges. So not necessarily a technical challenge, but definitely a administrative challenge to get that cybersecurity program in place. The cybersecurity program will drive the policies that will support the program. So this is another requirement that needs to be in place currently to be compliant. And this is a tricky one. You need to have a chief information security officer. So you need to designate somebody in your company who is qualified. And qualified is really kind of the sticking point here, is that you really want somebody as your CISO who understands security. So I know there are a lot of people in companies that are, you know, very technically savvy, but if they don't have the security knowledge, they may not be considered to be qualified. So in these cases, this regulation does afford the ability to outsource this particular function until such time that somebody internally can be groomed, somebody outside can be hired, or if you're just kind of a small business and you really don't have the capability to take this position on full time, you can outsource this and have somebody come in and help to drive and steer your cybersecurity program. So we have access privileges. So this is kind of one of the first technical controls or technical analysis that needs to be undertaken. So you need to take a look at all the data that is considered to be protected by this particular regulation and limit the access to that particular information. So it's kind of along the lines of the notion of least privileged. If you have data that somebody does not need access to, you should restrict that access to data. And there's a provision to periodically review this. So once you go through the exercise, you're expected to go through this exercise on a, you know, perhaps an annual basis, whatever makes sense for your organization. Okay, so cybersecurity personnel. So you've established your program, you established your policies. Now you need people that actually can help to build this up from an architecture standpoint and a day-to-day maintenance standpoint. What this particular provision is stating is that you really need to have qualified people, much like the CISO, where just because you have a collection of folks that are, let's say, network engineers, network admins, if they haven't really delved in security before, then they may or may not be considered to be qualified personnel. So there's another provision that we're going to talk about later, and that pertains to training, and that's where you would really bolster your technical staff to be more qualified with respect to cybersecurity staff. You need to establish an incident response plan. So if anything were to happen from a cybersecurity event or an incident, that you have that plan in place to act upon, much like Equifax had to enact their plan probably a couple times over the past month or so, unfortunately, where they had to enact their incident response plan. And certainly it's better to have this on paper and practiced a few times versus having to cobble this particular plan together once you're in the middle of a particular breach or an event or an incident. So really the regulation is trying to an incident response if you have a plan in place to execute versus it on the fly. And the next provision is notices to superintendent. So if you have detected a cybersecurity event, incident, breach, it must be reported to the superintendent of DFS within 72 hours. So our next milestone, which is coming up in 2018, so now we get a little bit of breathing room, right? So if everybody's compliant with the last set of requirements, now you get a little bit of breathing room until March shows up. And in March, this is what we need to deal with. You need to perform a risk assessment of your particular company. And what this really states is that on a periodic basis, you're going to take a look at your business, your information systems, where that non-public information is housed, and your business operations, and take a good hard look at that and try to identify where there are particular risks to your company. And then in provisions to that, you need to develop policies and procedures about how you're going to go about addressing those risks. So, and you also need to make provisions for revising your risk assessment over time as given risks change. It should obviously be documented, and it's got to roll up to your policies and procedures. So they just want to make sure that this risk assessment is in line with your cybersecurity policy and your procedures. It makes specific provision for assessing the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the information systems and non-public information. And as mentioned before, it describes how the identified risks will be mitigated, accepted, risk transferred to accept those risks. Address those risks, I'm sorry. The next item that needs to be addressed at this particular milestone is penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. So you've got to include security testing, and it must be developed in accordance with the risk assessment to properly test the cybersecurity program. So all we've done in the past is really build a program where we say this is how we're going to go about securing things. This is the practical assessment of the controls that have been implemented to protect particular information that is sensitive as it relates to this particular regulation. So this is where the proof is in the pudding. If the controls you put in place are effective, they should withstand a penetration test and/or vulnerability assessment glowingly. If they don't, you need to take the results of these penetration tests and vulnerability assessments, fold that back into your program, get them addressed, rinse and repeat on a regular basis to make sure that you're mitigating vulnerabilities over time. Next item that's required by this milestone is multi-factor authentication. And this is required for external access into a covered entity's internal network. So no longer are VPNs with just username and password good enough. They're looking for multi-factor type authentication so people can really prove who they are by not only something that they have, something that they know. Providing that two-factor for authentication is really key here. Training and monitoring. So as mentioned before, your cybersecurity personnel and your employees, they do require regular cybersecurity awareness training. Now, a lot of people really believe that the human element is the weakest link in security, and it certainly is when you hear about all of these attacks that take place via spear phishing. It just seems like a lot of stuff is in the news lately, and that seems to be the common vector of attack. And really, you can put up as many technical controls as you want, but there's always going to be pinholes that these email-based attacks can certainly traverse, and that's where training your personnel in the ways of cybersecurity is really going to reduce that exposure. On August 31st, 2018, that's your second technical compliance milestone. I'm sorry, that should be your third. This is where audit trails need to be implemented. So to know that you've had a breach, you've got to be able to detect a breach. If you don't have audit trails and you have no way of telling if authorized access has occurred, it's really hard to go about researching a breach or an event. So really what they're saying here, and they give us a little bit of time because they know it's maybe difficult to implement this audit trail, is that any of that sensitive data that's accessed, there needs to be a record of who accessed it and when. Application security. So this is kind of tripped up Equifax because they were using libraries that were vulnerable, the Apache Struts libraries. Maybe had they been doing a little bit heavier or diligent application security testing, might have been caught and saved them a lot of pain. But in this particular requirement, you need to have a written procedure and guidelines and standards to prove that you're developing applications securely, not only in-house, but if you have any third parties that are developing your applications, you're on the hook for making sure that they're developing them in a secure fashion. The next item is limitations on data retention. So really the thrust here is that New York State DFS doesn't want to see companies, carry years and years and decades worth of this non-public information. Really, it's to trim back the amount of data that you need to have on hand to do business and house no other or older type of data. So they want you to have a policy in place that says, okay, we age out data. Let's say you have a 7-year retention requirement. You shouldn't be keeping any data that's over 7 years old. And that's digital and physical. And encryption of that non-public information. So really, this is just another protection layer of that data. If you're providing encryption of that data, less of a chance that it comes into the hands of somebody that can actually do something with that. So really, they're just stating that encryption is another factor, another defense in-depth mechanism to protect that financial information. And the final technical compliance milestone is March 1, 2019. So did quite a bit of time on this one. Not really sure if this one out so far. I'm sure there was some legal wranglings, but it's really third-party service provider security. So guaranteed there's a good number of people that are using cloud-based services, co-load services, to help process this financial information. Really what this is saying is that you need to come up with a policy to assess the security of those third parties. Just as you would investigate and secure the data within your own walls, you need to also have a program to take a look at how third parties are dealing with your data. So enforcement, this is somewhat vague. They basically, DFS has made the statement that it could be anywhere from a slap on the wrist to perhaps serious sanctions for the business or fines. So it's regulations will be enforced by the superintendent pursuant to and not intended to limit the superintendent's authority under applicable laws. So you could take that from anywhere from a company being completely non-compliant and getting perhaps fined very severely, or a company that has maybe tried to become compliant, they missed a couple of stones or didn't uncover a couple of stones in their journey to become compliant. They showed their best effort. Maybe they get quote-unquote slap on the wrist, but it's not like HIPAA or PCI where the enforcement is kind of scheduled. This is kind of up to the superintendent to decide how bad the penalty should be. So the question is, do you have a lot of work to do here in the future? Have you met the August technical deadlines? Are you still scrambling to put those together? Have you even started? If you haven't started, these other timelines or these other milestones are really gonna start coming at you fast. If you have a mature security program, likely this is just a lot more paperwork for you to do. It's just part of doing business. But if you have a less mature security program, you may have actually a lot of work to get done to become compliant with this particular legislation. And as I said, there are 16 particular items that need to be addressed, and none of them are really jokes. So if you are behind the curve, I think now is the time to start really putting the nose to the grindstone and getting down with this stuff. So with that, iSECURE can definitely help with a lot of these particular compliance requirements. You know where to find us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And while we wait for potential questions, if anyone has any, and if you do have any questions, please enter it into the chat box. But in the meantime, I'm just going to take a few minutes to discuss a few housekeeping items and wrapping up our webinar series this week. And for those of you who have joined our series in the past, after the series is over, we usually send over a envelope of tchotchkes from our vendors. This series, instead, we're having a drawing for Amazon gift cards. So the more that you've joined the sessions this week, the more opportunity you have to win. And Mark Johnson is in charge of that, so we'll figure out how to communicate back to all of you. Also for those of you who have attended the webinar series and need a proof of attendance for CPE credits, please email Mark, marc.johnson@iSecureNet.net. At the end of the week, which is today, and he can send over a certificate for the webinars that you attended. If you have any inquiries regarding the topics that we've discussed during this week, please feel free to reach out to anyone on the iSECURE team, and we'll have the appropriate person follow up with you promptly. Lastly, Mark probably will be sending out a survey at the end of the series in the next day or so to get your feedback on the presentations. And your feedback is key in helping us improve for future events like this and any of the other events that we do during the year. I don't see any questions. Let me take a quick look.
There's only one, and we will have all of the slides and presentations on YouTube next week. So please reach out then, and we'll get you that link and everything.
All right, perfect. Thank you again for joining us this week for our webinar series. We hope you enjoyed the presentations, and thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks all.
Thank you.